Now, I thought it was a good development that Jimmy Carter called Israel an apartheid state. He was referring to the occupied territories. He should have actually looked more closely into Israel's society, and he would have discovered that in fact the apartheid analogy is within Israel itself. Now, the post-67 situation, of course, brings into comparison the Bantustan policy and everything that entails. So that for Verwoerd, since black people were not going to be given citizenship in white South Africa, they were going to be allowed to have their own citizenship in 13% of South Africa, known as the reserves, something that South Africa as a colonial country shared with Canada and learnt from Canada, the reserve system here, and that goes way before apartheid, of course, and there are tremendous analogies. In fact, the question of the Bantustans in South Africa was that at least you were talking about something that was well-defined with well-defined boundaries in that 13%, something like 9 Bantustans. I mean, horrendous places, miles and miles, hundreds of miles away from the wealth of the country and the infrastructure and the main centers. But I said to President Arafat Mohammed when I visited him in 2004 with the South African delegation, we had travelled around the occupied territories, and then we came to the Mokata in Ramallah, his headquarters, which was almost pulverized in 2002 when the Israeli Defense Force went in on that occasion. And Arafat said to us, well, you now see the conditions under which our people live. It's just like a Bantustan, isn't it? And I waited for a moment and I said, well, Mr. President, I disagree with you. It's not just like a Bantustan. So there was a bit of shocked silence. You could have heard a pin drop. And I said, you see, President Arafat, it's far worse. Everybody was hanging on to every word. And I said, in our Bantustans, you travel towards them, the only signs that you were coming to the Bantustan was that the very good road system was running out from the macadamized road system into gravel, inferior gravel, and the terrain was becoming rather bleak. If you looked very carefully, you might just glimpse the sign on the side of the road saying you are now entering the Transkei or Venda or whatever. Mr. President, there are no walls, apartheid walls around the Bantustans. There were not even continuous barbed wire fences. And it was only when there was tension in the land, and of course at times there was operations within a Bantustan and so on, that you would find a police contingent or the military contingent at that crossing point. But you see, Mr. President, there was never one occasion in the whole history of South Africa that the South African Defence Force sent in their tanks or their warplanes to bomb and rocket the people within those Bantustans. And by the way, they did very cruel things, and we had people massacred from time to time, as you well know. It was an obnoxious system. But in fact, there were very few instances in the townships now, like Soweto, Cato Manor, Durban, District 6 in Cape Town, Khayelitsha, these big African townships, where at times of the people resorting to strike action and demonstrations and the like, it would be in that period that there would be a encirclement of the township, and they would have the checkpoints, and they would go in with the military or the police house to house looking for people. But this would never last more than a couple of weeks or so. I'm not belittling what our people had to face. I've said it was horrendous, and the world came to see it and to stand by us. But just as Archbishop Desmond Tutu stated when he went to Israel in the late 1990s, went into Palestine, and he said that what the Palestinians are going through makes what we lived through child's play by comparison. It wasn't child's play, but get the gist of the rhetoric there. People so shocked, South Africans so shocked at what we saw and what you see on the television sets and so on over all these years, that every South African has said these are people from the freedom struggle. Everyone will say this is far worse than what we encountered. So I would submit that clearly to use the analogy is a very helpful one. But you know, this question of ideology brings it home even more, because you had the apartheid system and its legal system and its laws, all based on, as I mentioned earlier, on the race purity issue, because that's what the question of Israel only for Jews is about. And what you find in this analogy is what you well know here from Canada's experience and dispossession of the Native American people here, or in the United States, or what befell the Aboriginal peoples of Australasia. And that was, firstly, that the colonizers who came to South Africa, Dutch and then British, in their different ways talked about the civilizing mission, to come to the heathen and to bring civilization to them. Obviously, their rationale and justification for setting up the colonial system. But the homegrown Afrikaner settlers took this much further as they trekked as pioneers into the interior of the country, because they weren't happy with British rule in the Cape. And they spoke in those biblical terms, those very same biblical terms: chosen people, covenant with the Lord to deliver our enemies into our hands, Bible and gun, and the dispossession process, together with the dispossession that the British and the Dutch had been involved in. And this is why, when we wash away the cobwebs from that Holocaust era, which was very cleverly followed through from 48, it's really not difficult, comrades, friends, ladies and gentlemen, to see that Israel is a racist colonial settler state. And that's what the analogy with apartheid's all about. Excuse me. So it's not that we are simply invoking apartheid to build up hatred against Israel and its citizens. It's a question of being able to characterize a system correctly. Because if we don't, then you make all sorts of errors. And there have been huge errors made in terms of the Palestinians' right to land, to return of refugees, to their rights and their dignity. I've seen this myself with my own government and my own party, the ANC. The moment one accepted the paradigm that Israel and its supporters had managed to put across, that this is about two people, both with justice on their side and both with just objectives, and that the struggle of the Jewish Zionist people that created the State of Israel was as a war of national liberation. That the moment you analyze then what this state is about, it's very, very clear that what we've come to see in the 20th and now well into the 21st century, that what had befallen indigenous native peoples of North and South America, of Africa, Asia, Australasia, is a project which was brought into existence by the Zionist movement at the end of the 19th century, and because of particular circumstances put into effect, implemented with the 1948 Declaration of Independence. From that point of view, we're perfectly correct to make the analogy and to help with the strategizing. Because if you're going to, and you do need to argue with your government here, and with opinion makers in this society, in this country, and with those of the Jewish community who genuinely believe they're being wronged, that one needs to be able to identify and characterize, as people like Mordecai and other veterans around the world from a Jewish background have been doing, because this was a small group that had been stronger in the past. At the end of the 19th century, the Zionist ethnic nationalists of Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire turned away from the idea of common cause with the working people and the other suffering minority groups of the Russian Empire, and said out of Zionism that the whole world and the whole history is always against the Jews, so we must be on our own, it's got to be exclusive. But they had it tough. In the first place, the rabbis did not accept their argument. And I'm not going to go into that, but it's all got to do with the fundamentalist view of the Bible and the teachings thereof. They've changed now. But within Jewish communities around the world, which were socialist imbued, you had a tremendous basis to debate and refute the Zionist argument. And we must remember that in our discussions and arguments with the Zionist groups, because they don't know their own history, they don't care to know it. It's hidden purposely, because the truth actually explains the just case, the just cause, the legitimacy of the Palestinian struggle. Well, when we come to that struggle, it's not an easy struggle. It's littered with the bodies and the blood of countless numbers of Palestinians, of women and children amongst them, of an ethnic cleansing project that goes back to 1947, 1948, and continues to this day. So again, if we fail to make the proper assessment of Zionism, as I found, and I've interacted with a lot of politicians around the world and a lot who are sympathetic to Palestinians, people in government and in fact in my own, that when they don't understand this, they fall for this this approach which comes out of Annapolis, which comes out of allowing the quartet, instead of the people themselves, to develop their own struggle and their own solution. And they believe in the end they caught up with having to be balanced in terms of Israel and the Palestinians. The question of how far this is taking Zionism is an absolute scandal. But it shouldn't be surprising, because when you analyze in history any doctrine based on race, and which gives those who have that and run that project the justification to then in the end do anything, the ends justifying the means. And we've seen from 47, 48, through 56, through 67, through the first, second Intifada, through the onslaught of Lebanon in 2006, 1,500 mainly civilians killed, lots of women and children. And then we see this horrendous onslaught on Gaza, with absolutely no semblance of any form of humanity for the people concerned. So that Gerald Kaufman happens to be a Labour member of Parliament in Britain, actually rather right-wing. And I can remember I was in Britain in the period of 68 and so on. He was Harold Wilson's press officer, and he would attack the demonstrators on the Vietnam issue, left, right, centre. He himself has classified himself as a friend of Israel's and has been going there every year for yonks. He made a comment the other day about the spokesperson, some major, a woman of the Israel Defense Force, who tossed aside the question of non-combatants being killed, and without any emotion said, well, this is the kind of thing that happens in war. But actually we Israelis, our defense force, is the most compassionate and humane in the world. He said this woman talks exactly like a Nazi. Okay, so we're not saying it's a Nazi state, but you see there are measures that they use, and there's a mindset which makes us, again, it reminds us of what happens to human beings when they allow themselves this form of self-righteousness. And for me, one of the most revealing statements that I've come across from the annals of Israeli history was made in 1948 by the first Minister of Agriculture of Israel, Aharon Sisling, who after the Deir Yassin massacre was revealed, in which 240 men, women and children were just butchered by the Irgun, their terrorist group at the time, and the Stern Gang. He said, now we too have behaved like Nazis and my whole being is shaken. This is the nature of what we're facing. So that when you look at the obscenity of the weaponry used on Gaza and what was used in the Lebanon, where white phosphorus bombs were first noted